Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff Mom Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. Today, we're very excited. It's time for one of our very favorite segments here on Sminty, Female First. And that means we are joined by one of our very favorite people, Yves. Hello, Yves.
Hey, y'all.
Yay!
How are you doing, Yves?
I am doing well. I feel like that's such a loaded question.
It is, that's true.
Anytime anybody asks me how I'm doing, I'm like, oh, I have to feel all the feels right now. But it's a good thing. Like I'm okay with working through that. But I feel hopeful.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll say that.
That's good.
That's a good place to be.
Yeah. I am very excited to talk about the person you've brought for us today, Yves. So who did you choose?
I am very excited to talk about Lucy Hicks Anderson.
Yay.
She's who we'll be talking about today. And it's honestly so long overdue to be talking about a trans woman in this series.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot that's not known about her history, but I did a deep dive into all of the newspaper articles on her. And it's super weird and also fascinating to kind of track the way that the local newspaper was talking about her. But just to say what her first is and was she's considered one of the first trans people to fight for trans rights in court and considered the first Black American trans woman to be put on trial for her identity. And as always, there's so many firsts happening for trans women today, just because of access, because of whose story is told and distributed. And that being said, trans women have been pioneers for so long. They've been first for so long, but have so frequently gone unrecognized. So, yeah, that caveat that happens around first happens here, just as we always do in other episodes. But it's particularly relevant in this case just because of how frequent trans women, and especially trans Black women, go unrecognized in history.
Absolutely. And selfishly, one of my biggest frustrations when I research women of history is, or just history in general, the terminology didn't exist. And I never, ever, ever want to use the wrong identity for someone if I can help it. But for so long, there was no terminology. And because of that, I'm glad you put that caveat that so many people have probably definitely did have first that are unrecognized.
Yeah, I was definitely going to bring up the language thing. I mean, as we know, language is always changing, and we want to use the terminology that a person would have wanted to use for themselves, and that Lucy Hicks Anderson has been put in this category of, trans women. And for that reason, we can say it was that first for a trans woman. But, terms like transsexual, transgender, and two-spirit are relatively new through over the course of history in terms of when they were coined and when they started becoming part of popular usage. But the trans, non-binary, and genderqueer identities have really existed for so long, for centuries. And obviously, gender is complicated, and our knowledge around it and our understanding of it and perception of it is consistently transforming. And it's also so personal, it's so personal and so specific to a person. So that means that finding first for trans folks who are no longer with us and can't speak for themselves is really difficult. And but still also so important to me. It's because that's so difficult.
Yeah.
I think that's why it's important to bring to the forefront a person like Lucy Hicks Anderson. I can't just say, oh, it's difficult. I'm not gonna talk about this person and try to frame it as a first because the language around it is changing. Let me just bring her story to the forefront because that's what needs to happen.
Right.
And that's on top of the fact that they were so often marginalized and persecuted for their identities, regardless of what the identity was called. And they had to be very discerning about how they presented themselves and what they chose to record because, once it's written, once it's recorded, it's there. And also on top of that, their histories were often sidelined by cis folks who were actually doing the recording of the history.
Mm-hmm.
So all those things, that just makes this a multi-layered situation, but doesn't negate the fact that Lucy Hicks Anderson's story is one that we deserve to learn about.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love, this was such an amazing story. It was almost like a page turner because I thought, when I first looked her up, okay, chef. And then I was reading along, like, oh, wow, this is going in a direction I really didn't anticipate.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, there a lot of twists and turns. I will say that in her story, I'll just start off with a content warning up front because there is some mention of violence against women in this conversation. But yeah, it's it's twists and turns in this story. I mean, and it's super fascinating. And I think also telling that the people who were the ones who recorded her words, I think we have to be careful because in the newspapers that quote her, it's she's not quoting herself. Those are other people who are saying what she said in the courtroom. So, but yeah, a lot of twists and turns. So shall we begin?
Yes. Let's begin.
So she was born in Waddy, Kentucky in 1886. She grew up there and she knew from a young age that she was a girl. So she wore dresses and she started going by the name Lucy when she was super young. And as the story goes, her mother took her to a doctor when she was 9, and the doctor recommended that they raise her as a girl. And so she left school at age 15 and she began doing domestic work. So after a while, a little bit later in life, she married her first husband, Clarence Hicks, and that was in 1920. And she did later divorce him in 1929. They actually separated, I think, around 1926. Before they got to the point of actual divorce, they have been separated for a while. But when they were together, they moved to Oxnard, California. And so she did domestic work there too. And as you brought up earlier, Anney, she worked as a chef. She was popping in Oxnard. After she saved enough money, she purchased a boarding house and she ran a brothel there and a speakeasy. And this was during Prohibition. And so, yeah, like I said, she was popping. She was really well known for, in the community, she would host parties that people loved to have her at in terms of her serving and her hosting and her cooking. And she also appeared in the city and county courts a lot when she and other sex workers in her establishment were arrested in raids. And reportedly, when she got arrested one night, Oxnard's quote-unquote leading banker bailed her out because he had planned a huge dinner party that would have failed if she were actually incarcerated. So he wanted her to be there so badly.
Wow.
He bailed her out.
My dinner party is in danger. Take my money.
Yeah, which I think speaks to just how well-liked and well-loved she was in the community there. Yeah, so in 1944, she married Reuben Anderson, who was in the Army. And there's not a ton of information out there about her life, but according to scholar C. Riley Snorton, who wrote the book Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, which has a lot of cool information on Lucy Hicks Anderson in there. But a lot that was documented about her was taken from articles that were written between 1945 and 1946. And that's when her trials actually started getting a lot of media coverage across the U.S. A lot of it was obviously centered in California because of Oxnard, and that's where it was based. But there was also national coverage of her court cases, which we'll get to in a second. I would recommend, if you're interested in learning more about Lucy Hicks Anderson, reading those newspapers. They are documented online, you can get access to them online. But there is a lot of dehumanizing and anti-trans language in those articles, as well as a lot of misgendering. There's dead naming in there, and they put her name in quotes. So, yeah, like expect that when you read through those articles. Like they often appended Negro to her name. They were like, Lucy Hicks Anderson, Negro, or Lucy Hicks, Negro. Like that was an essential part of her name. And often, too, would call her like John Doe and then put Lucy in parentheses.
Wow.
Or like just straight up call her the Oxnard Negro, as if there was only one black person. There was only one black person in Oxnard at the time. And you bet it was Lucy Hicks Anderson. But all that said, like there is that's the language that you'll encounter when you're reading these descriptions of all the stuff that was happening to Lucy at the time.
We have some more for you listeners, but first we have a quick break for a word from our sponsor. And we're back. Thank you, sponsor.
Speaking of articles, there is this one that comes up that's kind of a flashpoint in her life. On November 5th, 1945, there was an issue of Time magazine that included an article on Lucy.
Wow.
Yeah, and the title of the article was Sin and Souffle.
Oh.
Okay,
yeah, so you can imagine what this is going to be about.
Lord.
And it was titled that because, according to the article, that's what Lucy trafficked in, sin and souffle, in quotes, trafficked in. And the article describes how she cooked for Oxnard's leading families and how her cooking was the quote-unquote talk of the town. So I want to read an excerpt from the article so you can get a better sense of her character and appearance through the words of the person who wrote the article. But here's the quote. As Oxnard grew, Lucy's lone body house expanded into a half block of frame buildings, each well-furnished, neatly painted, and with window boxes full of geraniums. In Ventura County, she became as well known as Oxnard's huge American Crystal Sugar Company refinery. Lucy was the more spectacular sight. She wore bright, low-cut silk dresses from which her slat-like collarbones protruded, and she affected picture hats and high-heeled shoes. Her wigs were her pride. She had a long, black, wavy one, a short, straight, bobbed one, and for special occasions, a shoulder-length job in red. So her wigs is like one thing people love to talk about in these articles. They were like obsessed with her wigs. So it also said in the article she gave generously to the Red Cross, to the Boy Scouts, and to the charities. And all in total, like the article is really laudatory of her life in Oxnard and the things that she did in Oxnard. It was said that in the article she was immune to the law because of her local fame and knowledge of town secrets. And I'm like, ooh, I want to know these town secrets.
Right.
But those weren't mentioned. So I'm like, well, what are those? Anyway, it also said that she had purchased nearly $50,000 in war bonds. Basically, the tone of the article in the beginning was Lucy was doing really well. You know, she was this great community figure. She did a lot for a lot of people. She was moneyed. But at the end of the article, it was like this, if not Shyamalan twist, where it was like it said that a sailor had gotten an STI from one of the women at Lucy's brothel. And of course, it's posturing this in a way where like that's a bad thing. And the article said that the women there, including Lucy, were forced to undergo a medical exam when this sailor had brought up this instance. And there's this kicker at the end of the article. The very last sentence of the article is Lucy was a man. Like that was the punchline. And the whole life that they described so glowingly up until that point was like part of the joke. So yeah, super bad. But it was, this led to like basically another chain of events. Like it was a snowball after this whole forced medical examination situation. So it was revealed that Lucy was assigned male at birth. And then at that point, the Ventura County District Attorney voided her marriage to Reuben and arrested her for perjury. So he justified that charge by saying that she signed the marriage license saying that there were no legal objections to the marriage.
Right.
So in that case, at the time, marriage was supposed to be between a man and a woman. That was how marriage was defined. And in their eyes, Lucy was not a woman. So by saying that there were no legal objections to the marriage, by signing the marriage license, she was in effect committing fraud, like she was lying. So she pleaded not guilty to that charge of perjury. And at the same time, the whole time, the district attorney was maintaining that she was a man and therefore incapable of marrying Reuben. And yeah, that's how that whole situation kind of started. It snowballed into a lot more back and forth with the court system.
Yeah.
I feel like that Times article was just kind of like a gotcha article. They were trying to be so shocking to the level of like trying to get the shock value. It's such a weird like way of leading up to it.
I also think that it worked in opposition to the goal that they were trying to, that it seems like they were trying to go for, which is like, well, she's an amazing person as far as you tell me. Like the first 3/4 of this article, and it wasn't that long, the first 5, 6 of this article are very praising of Lucy. Right. So like, as far as I can tell, like, what's the issue? She sounds like she's like a source of joy in this community. Mm-hmm. That's the impression that I got from it. So yeah, it's very weird, but also, not to be expected,
Right.
Yeah, so she went through a week-long trial in Ventura County, and there was medical testimony given at the trial where the doctors attested that Lucy was a man, and Louise Gale testified as Lucy's sister. She said that she was Lucy's sister, and she affirmed Lucy's testimony that a doctor had told her that she was, quote, more of a girl than a boy in her childhood, referring back to the part of her life that we spoke about earlier when her mother took her to the doctor. Mm-hmm. So Lucy testified that Reuben was her husband. When they asked her, like, is Reuben your husband? She said yes. And she also said that she planned on staying with him till death do us part. Yeah, so Lucy's defense attorney presented this theory that Lucy had, quote unquote, hidden organs that couldn't be discovered until she went through an autopsy after she died. So I want to highlight, because this just says it so concisely in a way better than I could, but I wanted to highlight a part from Snorton's Black on Both Sides book that I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to read a quote here. In exchange for an unincarcerated life, Hicks Anderson's hidden organs defense offered up her corpse to be put to indefinite institutional use, indexing the medical industry's sustained practice of experimentation on Black bodies in the United States. Though Hicks Anderson's defense comprised a critique of medical wisdom as a science of the surface, it also highlighted how Black flesh had long been central to medical professional knowledge. And it's so relevant to things still happening today, Black bodies being offered up for medical experimentation and for use as if they should just be objectified and treated as flesh, in the wording of the author from that quote. Yeah, and it's just gross, to put it plainly. So on November 27th, 1945, a jury found Lucy guilty of perjury, and she was incarcerated in the men's section of the Ventura County Jail, something that's also still happening to this day. Mm-hmm. She was facing a term of up to 14 years in state prison. I think it was a minimum of 1 year and a maximum of 14 years in state prison for quote-unquote perjury on this marriage license. But she was, in the end, sentenced to 10 years on probation, with the first year spent in county jail. So she was incarcerated at the county jail from December of 1945 to May of 1946. And in early June of that year, after she was released, in early June of 1946, she held a political rally and cookout to encourage people to vote. And you can read an article about this talking about the political rally that she held, actually. And they said it was a Democratic political rally, but the quotes that they give from Lucy Hicks Anderson in the article itself is she's like, I'm not for anybody, I'm just here. She was kind of very neutral in the situation, even though I think the rally was for like sheriff, and obviously positioned within the times in the conversations we're having around, really taking a stand in the ways that we talk about policing right now. It was just funny to read that article like in the context of contemporary times. But all that said, there was an article about that political rally and positioning her as this person who's upstanding in the community and like holding these events that people want to go to. But she would soon be incarcerated again. So rewinding a little bit, back in October of 1945, an FBI agent actually arrested her for failing to register for the draft in World War II. While she was awaiting her trial for perjury, her charge for violating the Selective Service Act was actually dismissed. So that charge for not registering for the draft was dismissed, but that FBI agent went hunting for information on whether she was getting allowances from the government for being the wife of a service member. So he was like, I'm going to get you now. Like, maybe I couldn't get you for the draft thing, but, we're going to find something. So Lucy did admit to getting texts from Ruben, but the question was whether she was just getting allotments for Ruben or she was getting a quote-unquote wife allowance, which was partly from a service member's pay and then partly from the U.S. Treasury. So that made it a whole different situation since she would be getting money from the actual U.S. government. So if the latter was the case, she would also be accused of defrauding the government. So, of course, this entire time, Lucy was having to affirm that she was a woman, like she was having to defend her identity. Ruben was also arrested. Her husband was also arrested while he was on duty at Mitchell Field in New York. So he was a corporal in the Army Air Forces. This was before the Air Force was established as a separate branch. So they were convicted of fraud. And Lucy was sentenced to a year in jail and a $900 fine in July of 1946. And so that $900 was about the same amount that she had gotten in allotments. And just to put that in context, like that's about $12,000 today when you're accounting for inflation. Ruben was also sentenced to a year in jail in New York. So, Lucy, she was also prohibited from wearing traditionally feminine clothes. And when they were released from jail, they were banned from returning to Oxnard, and Lucy was still on probation. But in 1949, Lucy was released from the terms of her probation after it was discovered that she had sold her Oxnard property. So the judge still advised that she stay out of Oxnard for at least the next year. But, at that point, Lucy, she rarely returned to Oxnard. And she spoke of missing her friends there, of course. I can only imagine what it was like for her to go through that, like emotionally and be essentially exiled from a place where she created so much love and so much community and like was thriving in a way. Obviously, there was still a lot that she was up against, but was a very active member of her community. So they lived in Los Angeles at that point, and Lucy died in Los Angeles in 1954. And it was reported in the Ventura County Star-Free Press, which is where that's the newspaper where you can read a lot of the articles that reported on her, kind of like, especially in that 1945, 46 time period where it's just kind of like, okay, article. There's a point where it's like an article every other day following her court case. But yeah, it was reported there that a niece was with her at death, an unnamed niece. I don't think they named the niece in that article, but that they also said that her cremation and her burial were unattended.
We have a little bit more for you listeners, but first we have one more quick break for a word from our sponsor. And we're back. Thank you, sponsor.
So that's the story of Lucy Hicks Anderson, and definitely one that I think is so important to tell and is also just so interesting to look back on.
Yeah, totally agree. I was so glad that you picked this one, and again, angry that I hadn't heard of her earlier. So it's always great to spotlight these people that we should be spotlighting. And her story is amazing. Like I wasn't exaggerating before when I was like learning about her so excitedly, and it was like, oh, and this, and then there's a brothel and it's prohibition, but everybody liked her so much they let it go on.
Right.
And yeah, reading about someone who was so well loved and it seems so generous with herself and her time and her money. And it just made me sort of like, it was very inspiring, and also sometimes I get really maudlin these days about like, oh, remember when we could do this thing with people, and just reading about all the community functions she planned, and like the welcome home parties, and she just seems so kind.
I mean, according to the articles and even just what you were talking about and the small bits that I was able to research, she was a pillar in that community. And because a doctor was forcibly trying to, I don't know, identify all the women in the brothel, which sounds very political in its way, of course, had to take down a woman who only wanted to love people. And I don't, it's just such a big statement of this label of what did this do? How did this help? It helped no one. There was nothing about what happened that actually helped anyone other than her coming out and saying, I will fight for who I am. And this is who I am. It's not even bigger than I'm going to fight because I am a woman and I've been a woman and I don't understand. You've been accepting me as a woman. That's what you've seen. And there was no question until this nonsense essentially comes about. And I did watch a short documentary on her when they said she was not above skirting the rules. That's kind of how and I'm like, I like her so much.
Yes. Yes.
I wish I had that courage.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what makes it so like extra sad that she essentially was exiled from a place she was so well loved and had built up all these friends, and then for her funeral to be unattended, that's so sad.
Yeah, I think that, like you said, Samantha, it doesn't make any sense to pull somebody, out of a community that was contributing so much to that community. It's like, what is this going to do for you? But that's how anti-transness works. That's how anti-Blackness works. And all of those things that are wrapped up in the life and story of Lucy Hicks Anderson, that, there was, and then the issue of morality on top of that in terms of her being along with and obviously all the things of the unnamed sex workers, because I didn't see any names of the sex workers who were also involved in all of the raids that were happening. But I think it's worthy to call out just that, there were a lot of other people who were also implicated in the things that were happening along with Lucy Hicks Anderson. But yeah, it's just indicative in a thing that's still happening today when it comes to the way that trans Black people are treated. And it's like, frustrating to see that Lucy Hicks Anderson was born in 1886.
Yeah.
Like, that was a long time ago. She operated during Prohibition, which like feels so long ago for us. It was, over the whole course of history, not super long, but we're so removed from that kind of time right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is frustrating in so many ways to see what Lucy Hicks Anderson had to go through. And even though a lot of her story isn't told through her eyes and through the eyes of the people who are writing these articles, it is refreshing to be able to kind of get a chance to form this image of a person, this full round character, because I think so often we don't get that opportunity to see a person as round and as dynamic as Lucy Hicks Anderson has been presented. Like I was saying earlier in that Time magazine article, it's like, y'all tried to make her flat, but guess what? Y'all did the opposite. Like y'all didn't take her personality away from her. Like, y'all still afforded her that. And I can see that through the article, no matter what y'all were trying to do.
Right.
And I appreciate getting the opportunity to at least try to be able to imagine Lucy Hicks Anderson in this more expansive way, where I see that y'all were trying to kind of slick make fun of her in these articles, the way y'all talked about how she walked in with her wigs on and her quote unquote women's suits on, and the way that she spoke about her husband, Ruben, and like saying, yeah, like we're good. And when they found out that she actually had been married before Ruben, that was a whole other thing. They were like, oh, well, you were divorced for somebody else. So they did a lot to try to tear her down, but I was still able to see her as this full person, this whole human being, I think, in looking back at the documentation of her. And I am, happy that we are able to bring these stories some light today.
Yes.
I love it. Yeah, and I just keep thinking, because it's a very small bit of what we have in her history, as you were saying, and it's very limited through the articles. But yeah, everything you read, every time I was jumped from one thing to another, it was just pretty much how she kept pushing and did bigger. Like whether it's, saying at a young age, no, I'm a girl, and the doctor being like, yeah, you are, to coming out at 15, making her own living, to being able to pay $50,000 for a home and business, and she's just doing it. And it's like, there's really not much to be said other than she's a success in the story. And she made sure that people knew, I guess history made sure that we knew she was successful. And that's it. And that's what she got outed by.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not being fooled.
No. No. It is, it's terribly, terribly frustrating and sad, but also kind of like you're saying, Yves, it's almost funny because it's like you're saying all of these nice things. Like if you're just giving me these sort of facts and they all sound really good, like it's like they were missing the whole point. And it almost becomes a joke on them. And of course, the power dynamics make it a dangerous thing. And one that, we're still seeing today. So there is that layer to it. But especially with our modern eyes, I was reading a lot of these articles like, this person sounds amazing, but I can tell you're trying to convince me that they're not.
Also, I'd want to be friends with her. She's the connection that I would have wanted to have.
Right.
At that point in time.
I would need the dinner party. They're willing to get her out of jail because she was so essential.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to, I think I know that the documentary you were talking about, the short documentary.
We've been around.com.
Yes. Yeah. We've been around. Yeah. Just wanted to, call attention to that.
Thank you, as always, for stopping by, Yves. Always a pleasure, and we really appreciate you bringing these stories. Legitimately excited every time to learn who you are spotlighting. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where can the listeners find you?
So y'all can find me at Yves Jeffco on Twitter. You can find me at Not Apologizing on Instagram. I am no longer the host of This Day in History class, but there's a huge backlog of episodes for the show. So if you still want to hear my voice on the show, you can listen to This Day in History class. You can also listen to Unpopular. And that's what I got, y'all.
Awesome. Definitely go check Yves out, listeners. She's amazing. You can also contact us if you want. Yes, that's right. We have an email address. It is stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can also find us on Instagram at Stuff Mom Never Told You, or on Twitter at MomStuffPodcast. Thanks as always to our super producer, Andrew Howard.
Thanks.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff Mom Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.